So quite a few people trickling in, but I know it's quite a popular webinar, as you can imagine, given the topic. So, firstly, some quick introduction. So, my name is Chris Hanlon, and I'm the CEO of calQrisk. For those of you who don't know me, if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, the webinars are recorded, and the slides and the recording will be made available later today or first thing tomorrow. So you'll receive an email with all the resources and things like that we step through anyway. So just to give you a quick rundown through of kind of who we are and what we do, I suppose, to kick us off. So I think Jerry is controlling the slides here. So maybe Jerry, if you want to move on to the next slide. Um, for those of you who don't know us, and I know there's a right mix of people on the call today. So we're a company called calQrisk. Most of our backgrounds are in risk and compliance. So we've been there and done that in terms of the hard yards with different ways of managing risk and compliance across different types of organizations. And we offer governance, risk and compliance software solutions and services, and obviously a DORA related solution as well. We're headquartered here in Ireland, but we've clients right across the world. And our client base is predominantly of financial services, but we do have clients in the public sector, not for profit, and other sectors as well. And really, what we're here today to talk about is DORA, because I know it's on top of a lot of people's agendas again, really, given the regulatory timelines and deadlines with the Register of Information coming up. So today we're just going to do a bit of a recap. I'm conscious there are people on the call that will be at different stages of their DORA implementation plan, and I'll leave it to Jerry to kind of touch on that a bit more. So just going to chat about what are the benefits, the real benefits of DORA. So for those of us that don't look at it as maybe another compliance tick box exercise, what are the real benefits we can actually experience? The built-in versus bolted-on approach. So how do we turn it from a piece of legislation or regulation or technical standards into more of a business as usual exercise? The dreaded Register of Information submission, which I know a lot of us will be working on over the coming weeks if we're not already working on it. And then one of the things I wanted to touch on then as well is a lot of us see the Register of Information or DORA as almost like the finish line to the regulatory hurdles, if that makes sense. But I just wanted to touch on two particular pieces of legislation or regulation or guidelines that are coming down the path and how they might help comply with DORA or certainly just expand their DORA compliance program. And then, yeah, just I think today we're going to touch on where are we now with DORA. And one of the things I just wanted to just very briefly touch on before I pass over to Jerry was this doesn't feel like it's another compliance exercise. You know, it's been around. A lot of us had a couple of years of a lead time. It really feels like the EU, for the first time, is regulating both the regulated firm or the regulated entity, but also going that one step further now and starting to look at the actual ICT supply chain and figuring out how the ESAs could regulate the critical third parties. And I suppose the reason why we talked about where are we now is that it feels like we're past the awareness phase, we're past the gap analysis phase, and really where a lot of firms are starting to move into now is more the evidence phase. So have we the evidence of mapping? Have we the evidence of third party oversight, evidence of testing where necessary? And really, how do we embed all of this? So it's not a sprint finish at the start of every year where we're doing the Register of Information. How do we actually bake it into our third party risk management approach? And I was talking to someone recently as part of a training session that I was doing, and they were asking, is it not very similar to GDPR where we all went into panic mode in 2017 or 2018? And I think back to then, I think there was two camps really. There was a camp where this is massive. We need regulatory change management programs. We need people, governance systems, solutions, and everything else. And then there was the other camp of this is overhyped. We just need to tweak a privacy notice or download something off Google and we'll be all grand. And I think very quickly we all discovered that it's here to stay, and hopefully or thankfully it's become part of a business as usual. There doesn't feel like there's a mass panic about GDPR. It's almost when we talk about data processing or when we onboard a new supplier, we immediately think of who has access to the data, where is the data stored, and how is it processed. So very much move from that regulatory change piece into more of an operational, and how do we fix our operational plumbing almost of when we're onboarding a supplier, what components of GDPR do we need to think of? And I think that's where we're getting to now with DORA, really, of it's moving from a change management project into a BAU project. And I'll pass over to Jerry now to maybe step through a couple of slides to give you a bit of an overview of where we think we're at with DORA, or where we think everyone is at with DORA. And then I'll jump back in on the horizon scanning piece. And I should have mentioned as well, if anyone does have any questions, by the way, please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and address them as we go down through it, or we can leave them till the very end, whichever makes more sense. So maybe over to you, Jerry, now for a couple of slides.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Chris. And yeah, I like and I very much agree with the the thought of business as usual, that we're moving into that phase. And certainly, I haven't heard of too many visits from the regulator to check compliance with all aspects of DORA, but maybe that's in the future. Mindful of the fact that we have a large attendance here today, and some of you are very experienced in DORA, and some of you are maybe just looking at it because you don't have to comply yet or don't have to comply at all. So really just to summarize what the Digital Operation Resilience Act is. It's a regulation and it applies to all EU countries. So that's good. So you don't have 27 different regulations to comply with. You've one if you're operating across borders. It did come into force back in 2023, yeah, believe it or not, but it was only really applicable from last January, around this time last year, about the 17th of January, I think it was. And for some, like the credit unions, they don't have to be compliant until January 28. Now, to them, I would say, what are you waiting for? There's nothing in DORA that is not a good thing to do. It's good for you and it's good for your customers. DORA applies to all financial entities and some of their service providers. I say some. In the post, if you like, submission of the DORA, the regulators came out with, I think, a list of 19 CTPPs, critical third-party providers. So those 19 will also be heavily scrutinized and certainly observed by regulators. Now, what is DORA? In English, I would describe it as it's about making ICT, that's information and communications technology. It's not just the boxes in the corner, the servers, but it's communications, it's voice, it's data as well. And it's focused particularly at the financial business. And it's about making it better in the sense of it's more secure, less likely to fail, faster to get back up if it does fail. I think in a word, resilient really is the correct description for it. Now, it does harmonize a lot of guidelines that have been out there in different countries, whether it's outsourcing guidelines or cybersecurity guidelines. It harmonizes those, and I think you'll see those guidelines now fading, and we'll be left with DORA and maybe one other for cybersecurity that goes into detail on cybersecurity. But importantly, it's one regulation for all. Okay, that's the summary. The benefits, and I would be one of the believers in these things ultimately are good for you. And even if you don't have to comply, I would say it's good for you. Why? Well, if you're meeting a higher standard, you're more attractive to a partner. Think back to 9001, ISO 9001, the quality management standard back in the 90s. Those of you who can remember that. And originally it was considered as a pain and a lot of paperwork, but it became almost standard. What? You don't have 9000? Certainly in the manufacturing area, if you wanted to deal with the larger companies, you had to be compliant with ISO 9000. Today, it's the largest, the number one most popular standard out there. But if you do comply with DORA, you will be more resilient. Simple fact, because of the things you would be addressing, the risks you would be addressing, the measures you'd be putting in place. Cybersecurity is, if you like, one risk, one big risk. And certainly it does address that. I mean, in these days of geopolitical unrest, cyber attacks are only going to get worse. Trust me. I read about these things every week, and it's scary what is possible. So it will make you more resilient to those attacks coming from cyberspace. But I think if you are resilient and you suffer interruptions, as we all do, and you can recover quickly, just think what that does for your reputation, somebody who can get back up fairly quickly. So I think it's good for you from that point of view as well. And ultimately, it'll reduce the overall compliance effort. You know, rather than having to comply with 10 different pieces of legislation, you find that that's now significantly reduced because it meets multiple requirements. If you have to comply with NIS2, NIS, the National Infrastructure compliance, you'll find with DORA, you're probably mostly compliant with that. But that's not what we're about here today. Just if you weren't convinced, if you're only doing this grudgingly, I would say embrace it. It's good for you. Okay, enough of the selling of DORA. So we're going to look at the 5 pillars. I'm going to look at them individually and see where are we now and what does the future hold. But just to give you the big picture, The 5 pillars are described as ICT risk management, information and communications technology, and that's Articles 5 to 16 in the regulation. The second one is incident management and specifically ICT related incidents. Now, I would be saying to you, if you're doing incident management, do incident management and don't just do the ICT incidents. But this is what DORA is about. But you'd set up a process and procedures to handle all incidents, I would imagine. Resilience testing. If you have a lot of plans for recovery and for handling incidents, you've got to test them. If you don't test them, you don't really know when the day comes, will you survive? And I have an anecdote that I often quote, and I think it's still true. I've been saying it for years. Data restore. 53% of data restores or data restores fail when you try to restore them, fail, and usually because the data wasn't backed up as you thought it was or wasn't accessible. So test. The big one, I think, going forward, certainly from my reading of stuff in the last month, is third-party risk and fourth party and fifth party. I think regulators, and this is worldwide, whether you go to Australia or whether you go to the States, they're all saying the same thing, that we outsource to third parties and we don't manage it. We don't have the oversight we should have. We don't do the due diligence we should do. So I think that'll be an area of increased focus in the next 12 months. And collaboration and cooperation, it's an encouragement for us and you to share your knowledge, your intelligence with your peers. We'll have a look at that. Okay. Timing-wise, we're okay. We're good. ICT risk management. Well, where I see it today in terms of where most of you are, I would say, is you have identified the ICT risks and analyzed them. So you know where the gaps are. You know where you need to improve. You're working on it. Interestingly, and this has been personal observation, but also from reading expert articles, I think the board have taken more interest in the last 12 months. They certainly want to know how well protected you are and your organization is to cyber attacks, because they know somebody or they know an organization who has been attacked in the last year. And I certainly know I would say within 5 miles of where I'm sitting, I know of 3 serious attacks in the last 12 months. So yes, I can see why boards are more interested. Now, because the boards are more interested and because this is a regulatory thing, I think, and you know where the gaps are, you probably are in a better position to apply for resources. I'm saying to you, if you're the person responsible for it, you probably are arguing for additional resources, be they financial or people. But now you have the ammunition at least, and you can do that. And it will take resources to address properly. I think there is clear definition of roles and whose responsibility. And this isn't just one department. We'll talk about it later, but if it's risk management, IT can't manage all the ICT risks. The human and the individual within the organization is still the biggest and the weakest link. So I would say risk management generally is a whole organization problem to solve. So we'll talk about culture and getting that awareness across the board. So next 12 months, I think we'll see a more documenting of the processes because if it's not documented, how can you have the consistency? How can you demonstrate that you are following your own policies and procedures? It's a bit ad hoc unless you document it. Now, I'm a convert to documenting and mapping out processes for many years because I feel when you do that, when you map it, or document it and map it, you find gaps. So it's a good exercise to do. The paperwork is secondary. Actually, the exercise of doing it is the value, I think. You will have a lot to do. And like anything in risk management, you prioritize your treatment. So do the things that will have the biggest impact first. That's what I think you'll be doing this year. I also think there's gradual, and I've been harping on about it for years, anybody who knows me in risk management is not a once a year exercise. You know, I've often been asked, how often should you do a risk assessment? And the simple answer is whenever there's a change in the context, a new regulation comes out, there's been a cyber attack in one of your competitors. So maybe your sector has been attacked. Time to have a look at your own defenses. You know, if there's something changes, whether it's an instance you've had or whether it's a new strategy you've adopted as an organization, a new objective. These changes are signals to you to risk assess. Not necessarily everything, but obviously the relevant stuff. And go back to culture. I think a risk awareness culture. We still have people clicking on those dodgy links. And I use the example of the Spanish lottery. Why would you click on a link to say you won the Spanish lottery if you didn't buy a ticket? And people do. And you've got to get that awareness. And it's not a once a year training on cybersecurity. It's an ongoing thing. I would say have a quarterly refresher and reminder of people. That's the only way you're going to change, through education. Okay. Incident management. And I know it says it's ICT related incident management, but I would be encouraging you to do all incident management, because incidents are intelligence. Incidents are telling you something about your processes and procedures. If you have an incident, something is missing, something that you maybe hadn't thought of, hadn't covered. So use the incidents as an input to make changes, to improve your resilience. If you're not recording them, you're missing that intelligence. It's as simple as that. Current status, I think a lot of you are recording incidents. I think probably not enough. If you are in health and safety, you will know about the inverted triangle, and you'll record all of the significant incidents and probably hardly any of the small ones. And I think you're missing intelligence if you're not recording all of them. Many of you have had incident management plans well before DORA and have adapted them to meet the DORA requirements. Specifically, there's a DORA requirement. If you have a major ICT incident, you have to record 76 pieces of information. That's a lot of information. If you haven't looked at that and you have a major incident and you're starting to look at the requirements, you're too late. So if you haven't started on that, you need to. What we've seen as well is boards, again, like more interested in risk management. They are more interested in incidents. And have we had any incidents? And how did we respond? Because how you respond and deal with those incidents is an indication of your current level of resilience. Think of it as a maturity model. If you're managing incidents well, getting back to normal fast, that's an indication. And certainly if I was a board member, I'd want to know what incidents we've had and how did we respond and did our plans work? But we're not there yet. When I say we, it's all of us. I think there's a bit of work to be done on the documentation and refining of that documentation. I think, and this isn't a sales pitch, but I think the days of recording things in Excel spreadsheets are numbered. I've always felt that they're not databases, and you need everybody to be feeding that information into incident management. So hard to do in Excel spreadsheets. But the key here is your response plans. If you have response plans to major incidents, whether it's a cyber attack or a severe weather event or a building loss or whatever it is, have you tested those plans? Because an incident, a real incident, is a way of testing your plans. So I would say record those and make changes. But I think you need to simulate. It's often called a desktop walkthrough of your plans. And this is a nice segue into the next section. Digital operation resilience testing. The regulators expect and will be expecting more in the next 12 months. Evidence, as Chris said, we're moving into that evidence phase. Evidence that you're testing your plans. I think many of you have, for many years, have business continuity plans, and they're still important and they're part of that resilience solution. But have you tested them in different scenarios? Like the severe storm, cyber attack, loss of power, loss of building. Pandemic, we probably have tested that one fairly well in the last 5 years. Now we all do backups, but how many of us do restores? And as I said earlier, do more restores and see, can you restore? We get our applications pen tested. We get our systems scanned for vulnerabilities. Now, sometimes when we say pen testing, it includes both. The vulnerability scanning is a bit like trying the outside doors and windows and see, can you break in? And the pen testing is, now that I've got inside, What damage can I do? But there's still gaps. And you'll see in DORA, if you've looked at it closely, pen testing isn't the only testing that is expected. The regulator, and I would say test plans under different scenarios. I've mentioned them already. Test your systems using different tools and methods. What do I mean by that? Well, the vulnerability assessments and scans that you know, but code reviews. If you have developed code that is critical to your operation or has been developed for you, has that undergone a code review? Are you using external third-party code in that code? Does somebody vet it? Does somebody say this is kosher? There's no embedded backdoors by people. Performance testing. Now, these are all from the DORA regulations. Performance testing, what does that mean? Everything works fine on a Tuesday morning at the beginning of the month, but how about on the 31st of the month on a Friday and it's busy? You know, will your systems crash because of volume? These are the sort of tests you need to do. You need to be resilient when your business is at its most busiest, because that's when the creaks will probably show. Compatibility testing. You know, systems, by the definition of systems, are comprised of multiple components. And if you change one of those components, does it still work? You know, at the very simplest, we used to have Internet Explorer, and eventually we used to say, we'd say to customers, we don't support it anymore because it wasn't being supported by Microsoft, and it didn't do all the things people wanted to do. So it wasn't it was no longer compatible. That was one component, a browser that changed, and the system didn't work anymore. So you need to be aware of those things. That if you change one part of it, will it still work? TLPT. It's full of acronyms, isn't it? Threat-led penetration testing. Threat-led penetration testing. This is about a 6-month project for large organizations. Now, the good thing about DORA is if you go to Article 16, there's a simplified version. If you're a smaller organization, then there is a simplified DORA that applies to you. And instead of, I think we did checklists for DORA, and I think the full checklist is about 1,200 items, and the simplified one is about 10% of that, maybe 15%, that kind of order of magnitude. But threat-led penetration testing, if you're a large financial organization like a bank, this is about having red teams and blue teams, having planning an attack, and the planning would be over 3-4 months, working with outside threat intelligence providers to come up with a credible scenario and organizing an attack on your own organization, and not telling the blue team, not telling the defenders this is happening next Monday. There's only one person in the organization who knows this is going to happen. And the idea is that you see, how do your own defenders respond, and can they fend off the attackers, and the regulators involved and the third party. Now, how you keep that secret beats me, but still, it's a lot of work, and it's the sort of thing they expect every 3 years. We can learn lessons from that, the concepts from that, but thankfully, most of you won't have to do a TLPT. At the other end of the spectrum on mine is, I think what you should be doing is the simple stuff, because that is all component parts of resilience. Password strength. Password strength is a function of the length of the password, not the complexity, to my mind, in simplicity. The longer it is, the more difficult it is to guess. And I'm not going to talk about quantum computing, but if somebody steals data today, then in 10 years' time, quantum computing they'll be able to crack today's passwords in minutes. So I think if your data is highly sensitive and has a lot of personal information, you should be setting a high standard of passwords today. Think of the future. Check your own policies and procedures. If you've movers, joiners, leavers procedure, for example, if somebody's left the organization at the end of December, we're now on the 20th of January, have all their access rights been removed? And why not, if they're not, So are your own procedures working? The regulator will not beat you up because you don't have a procedure for something. They'll beat you up and fine you if you're not following your own procedure. That is the biggest sin. So the paperwork is one thing, but do what you say you're going to do. And that's a big one. Good companies check on a quarterly basis who has access to what, the access rights on systems, because people move within the organization, they join and leave, and you need to keep that up to date. Limiting people's access has nothing to do with trust. It has to do with limiting the ability of attackers to navigate through your organization if somebody's credentials are compromised. So you want to limit that scope for an attack. So check on a quarterly basis. And again, it's part of that business continuity maybe and the incident management, but can you meet your own recovery time objectives? That is how, if you have a time objective to recover back in 2 hours or 4 hours, can you meet that? Can you say confidently to the board, we can meet that, we've tested it? And recovery point objective. If you don't want to lose more than 1 hour's data, then your recovery point objective would be 1 hour. So you lose no more than 1 hour's data. So obviously, the bigger that number, the more information data you're losing. Maybe you've set it down to 1 minute, in which case it's an expensive solution, but does it work? Check. And the big one now, I think the big one is third-party risk management, because I can't think of any organization who hasn't outsourced something to third parties. We did this exercise some years ago with a small company who thought they had 3 or 4 outsourced parties, and when they actually looked at it, they had 12. Now, working with large financial institutions, we see the numbers in the dozens and over 100. But even what I'm saying is even small companies have quite a few third parties, more than they think. Now, the regulator is interested maybe in the ICT third parties, but as Chris said in his introduction, we see that moving to all third parties. So I've left off the ICT on this. I think it's all third parties. It's good to see most companies now have a policy on outsourcing. Critical functions have been identified. You had to define what a critical function is. They've been identified because they're the ones the regulator was interested in for the Register of Information. And what we saw on the Register of Information back in the first quarter of last year was a lot of information gathering and a lot of information gaps. There's nothing like an exercise like that to show the blank spaces in your Excel spreadsheet. Indeed, we created 2 reports for our customers. One was the text report that showed where the missing information was. And customers said, yeah, that was very useful because if you just produced the codes report, it wasn't as obvious the bits of information you were missing. We've seen, done on ourselves, but we've seen it in our customers, a growth in due diligence. This is simple checking facts, checking information with people you're about to get into bed with, checking their financials, checking their cyber security defenses, checking their skill set. Can they do the job? So that's well advanced, I would say. But what's coming next? Because it doesn't stop there. As Chris said, this is evolving all the time. I think the regulator is encouraging people, and they'll probably make it the rule, to include not just the ICT parties, but all your third parties that you depend upon. If you depend upon them to deliver a function, they mightn't be ICT, but you depend upon them, they're still critical, aren't they? I see a big one on the contracts. Certainly in the middle of the year, there was another RTS on contracts. I think it was July of 2025. And I think where the interest is getting now is on the clauses in the contracts. And I've just picked a few here. But the clause on the subcontractors, and what is your policy on subcontractors? Do you need to vet the subcontractors before your third party hires a fourth party or maybe and a fifth party? Audit rights that should be built in, that you can audit your third parties, and I believe as well that the regulator would have the right to audit. Certainly the ones we've gotten, the addendums we've gotten to our contracts, I can see all of this stuff coming from the larger organizations. Instant notification. Do you have that in the contract? Do you require your third party to tell you if they have an incident, or can they keep it quiet? I'm all for full transparency. You have to have that trust. So the third parties should be telling you about their incidents, no matter how small. Have it in the contract, but it should be there because they're partners. And exit plan, again, the regulator will be looking for this, but it's good practice when you're signing up a contract, think about the day, and it probably will come sometime, whether you force it or whether they're getting out of the business. I mean, an exit plan doesn't have to be that you're unhappy and you're terminating the contract. Maybe it's the third party is getting out of the business. Have a plan. This is expected, but doesn't it make sense? That when you get into these relationships because they're not for life, so you got to think, well, how will we untangle this if we have to? I've put in this as identify the chain, but I've already mentioned subcontractors. This is the supply chain. This is the regulator saying you need to be aware if there's a fourth party and maybe a fifth party, and how far down do you go down the chain? I would say, and this is me, not the regulator, saying if a third or fourth or fifth party is handling a critical element of your service, then you should know about it, and that should be included. That's the simplest way I could describe it. And I think if you're doing exercises, think of the third party as part of your organization and include them in the exercises. I haven't seen as much of that as I thought I would in the last 12 months, but I think it's the next phase possibly. And so on to collaboration and cooperation. Now, I haven't seen an awful lot of the formal stuff. There aren't an awful lot of groups where you can share information with peers. I see a reluctance to share. First thing people think of is GDPR and am I sharing personal information? Nobody wants that. And it's not about personal information, but can I share in a safe environment? It's not mandatory, so it's not on people's priority list. But we've seen most countries now have a national cybersecurity center. And in a way, I see that as a way of sharing. They probably hear from many and they can share it with you. So if you're not tuned into your national cybersecurity center, then tune in because you'll at least have one additional source of, I call it threat intelligence. They call it threat intelligence as well. And there are more companies than individual companies who are offering this threat intelligence out there that you can sign up for. If you're a large organization, you probably have a partner out there that is already advising you. The idea of the threat intelligence is that you can't do everything, but with some, threat intelligence, you can at least make informed decisions on, well, what should I do now? What are the top 3 things I should do? Cover the biggest gaps you can, and threat intelligence will help you make that decision. So that's happening. What is also happening, we'll see more of, is that sharing at the supervisor level, that the CBI will share with their colleagues in Malta and with Luxembourg, share what they're seeing happening in the market, because you can be sure, these cyber attacks in particular, cross boundaries. They don't respect any geo or political boundaries. I see a slow move towards sector-specific peer-to-peer networks. What am I saying with that? Yeah, we will see networks growing and tentative toe in the water, but no major advancement here. Now, this is a cartoon I've been using for years. It's about dependency. We all are dependent on each other, and it's about all being in the same boat. So share, I would say. A couple of words on building it in, not bolting it on. The alternative name is resilience by design. So if you're planning, if a lot of the stuff that you've implemented now, the third parties, that's been around. But if you're planning new stuff, if you have a digital transformation project, and most of you probably have some element of a digital transformation, take DORA into account as you do it, so that the considerations are part of that planning, of that transformation. If you're moving to the cloud, think, what does DORA say? What does DORA recommend in terms of controls and resilience that you should put in place? And any other projects that involve technology, at the planning stage, consider DORA. That's building it in and not an afterthought, because build it in is always way cheaper than putting it in afterwards. we couldn't talk about DORA and not talk about the Register of Information. Last year's first quarter was crazy, and this was across Europe. And we know obviously our own customers, but even companies who weren't our customers last year they're telling us war stories from last year. It was a stressful time for you if you were the compliance manager and had to hit the deadline. This year, we hope it's going to be more measured, calm, controlled. The deadline is 31st of March. That's the EBA's deadline. And depending on what country you're operating from, where you're submitting your register of information, whether it's Malta, which I think is the 1st of March, or Luxembourg, which is the 21st, or in Ireland, the CBI. Now, I did read somewhere 4th of April, but I think that was an unupdated date from last year. So, but you can be sure it'll probably be at least a week before the 31st of March, because that's when the EBA has to have it. Good news is that both the CBI's own guidance on submission with advice on errors and how to correct them has been updated. It's better, it's more inclusive, and the EBA have a very detailed document with good information on the errors and what they mean. So if you haven't got the latest, and I'm talking about it was after May, I think last year, these were updated, but do download them. If you have difficulty finding them, let me know. But yeah, I think it's plain sailing. I think most people have, as I said, learned from last year, and hopefully it'll be a smoother run this year. I'm going to pass back to Chris now and ask him to talk a little bit about horizon scanning and looking a bit further down the road. Chris.
Sure, thanks, Jerry. Yes, just 2 minutes before we finish up on two pieces of guidance or regulation that are coming soon. We did a webinar on this back in October, November, I think, on the EBA guidelines on the sound management of third-party risks. So I think the consultation period ended in October. And the gist of it really is that it's very well aligned with DORA and existing local third-party risk management guidelines and regulations. Jerry already alluded to it as well, that while DORA had a lot of us focusing on just the ICT service providers, the reality is that the new guidelines are going to include or introduce a requirement for the non-ICT service providers. So anyone that we're dependent on that's outside the ICT supply chain as well, which to a certain extent is good news because we've been kind of treating them separate, which is a bit odd, if that makes sense. They are going to take a risk-based approach, the regulators, considering the complexity of firm size and business model and everything else like that. So we expect some guidelines or some more information on what that actually means when the guidelines actually come out. Critical function identification. This isn't new to anyone who's already gone through DORA, or if you're in the UK, your own operational resilience guidelines by the FCA or PRA. And then, yeah, a bit of around the lifecycle management, covering all phases of the third-party relationship. And one of the things I stressed on the webinar that we did back in October, November, is that a lot of firms focus on the onboarding of a supplier, but they almost never think about the exit planning. So what happens if that organization that we're dependent on, be they an ICT service provider or non-ICT service provider, were to be acquired, were to exit the market, were to go into liquidation? So there is a bit around lifecycle management, and that's really from initial onboarding and due diligence right through to exit planning. And then the other piece on the horizon scanning that I just wanted to point out, and I probably could have added 5 or 10 things to this slide really, is the operational incident and third party consultation paper that was published by the Financial Conduct Authority last year. So basically it looks like it's going to introduce a register. So I won't say similar to the register of information, but certainly aligned with DORA and ESA guidelines on outsourcing and third party management. And it's on material third-party arrangements. So not just outsourcing, it's actual third-party arrangements. The expectation is that it's going to be an annual submission cycle. For those of you who are regulated by the FCA, you'll have to upload it into the FCA portal. Unfortunately, it has 60 plus fields. I think it's 63 or 64 in the draft consultation. There is a template buried somewhere in the consultation paper or on the FCA website as well. So hopefully if you're dual authorized, if you have a European license and an FCA license, there's data points from the Register of Information and also then the FCA register, the third party registry you'll need to maintain in the UK that you can reuse. And if there's any other local third party or outsourcing registers that you'll need whatever other jurisdiction that you're actually in as well. So We'll do more on these in the coming weeks. As I said, there is a recording and slides on the EBA guidelines for the sound management of third-party risk, which we touched on in October, November, I think. We can include those as part of the resources if anyone is interested, or feel free just to hit reply to the email if you'd like a link and a copy of the slides for that. And as these become harder, we'll do more webinars and papers on them to see what the regulatory alignment will really look like. And obviously, we're all hoping for very close regulatory alignment, such that a lot of the work we've already put in for DORA will also satisfy the EBA guidelines on the sound management of third party risk. So I think that's really it from us. There's a couple of questions that, Jerry, I'll ping them over to you, or we can just chat about them here now, given that we've a few minutes, but they might be more for a written response as part of the resources as well. So one of them is just thanks for organising. Will the slides be shared afterwards? Absolutely. The slides will be made available afterwards, as well as a link to the actual recording of the webinar as well. And then Jerry, maybe do a question for you. I'd say you've spoken about the importance of resilience and testing your resilience. For a newly regulated entity in its first year of operations, how often would you expect the BCP, for example, to be tested once it's been board approved, considering the volatile nature and risk profile of year one operations?
Oh,
Just to put you on the spot.
no, it doesn't put me on the spot. The nature of these things, business continuity planning. It's not one plan really. I think there are things within the business continuity plan that, and this is personal experience. In a previous life, we used to restore a server once a quarter, and we used to have a different person do that restore. So that the skill was through the whole IT team. We had a team of 4. So some things you'll do quarterly basis. I think scenario exercises, they can be once a year as well. They don't require any system restore or anything like that. But you might pick a theme like a severe. We did one recently with the client, a severe weather event, because when we storm Eowyn, and they thought we hadn't prepared for that. It wasn't in the business continuity plan. So how often should you do it? Yeah, certainly once a year. But if something happens in the year and you said that's not in our business continuity plan, then maybe you put it in and you test that bit that you've added in. So I'll have to think about this, Chris, and maybe we'll have a longer answer. But I think it doesn't have to be one test for the whole thing. It can be individual tests of individual elements.
Yeah, we can include a couple of bullet points maybe in the email that goes out
Yeah.
as well. So there's just 2 other questions. And if anyone has any other questions, please do feel free to pop them in as well. So the other question is probably aimed at the horizon scanning slide that we're just looking at. So are the EBA third-party risk guidelines applicable, or are they still in draft? So the consultation period ended, I think it was October last year, and the idea is the final guidelines should be published, I think, in Q1 of this year. So the expectation is that there'll be a relatively long lead time. I'd imagine a year to 2 year lead time into them actually being enforced. But as Jerry kind of alluded to with DORA as well, if you're fortunate enough to have a window when it comes to regulatory change of actually needing to be compliant, you might as well get the ball rolling. But it does look and feel like a lot of the work you'll have done in DORA, or are going to do under DORA, will also satisfy a lot of the requirements in the EBA guidelines. And I said we'll be definitely doing more webinars and FAQs and things like that once those guidelines do firm up and get published. And then the last question, Jerry, is probably one that we might try and pick up offline as well, or included in the email or the resources email. So in relation to exit planning for an OSP, how can this be managed if you outsourced a lot of services to your parent entity? How can you have an exit plan defined in this kind of scenario? So we can pick that up though and include that in
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
resource email. But that is a trickier one though, about where you're depending on your parent entity for your own resource, sorry, for your own services as well. So, and yeah, how do you plan for that exit? Or if you have to plan for that exit as well. So we'll pick
Yeah.
that up and include that in the resources email too, I think.
Yeah. I think there are 2 scenarios in that. I think there's one where you have little notice, and one where you have plenty of notice. I mean, if it's a parent company, and they would have your good health in their mind as well. It shouldn't be short notice, but you never know. If a company gets acquired, it can change things fairly quickly. Yeah, we'll have a think about that one, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's it in terms of the questions. As I said, we'll be in touch later today or tomorrow with the slides and the recording and answers, or written some written notes to the questions as well. So thanks to everyone for your time, and yeah, as I said, if you do have any
Yeah.
questions, do let us know.
Yeah. Thank you, folks.